Welcome to the fourth part of this series on building a blog with Laravel, Sass, and vue.js, and today the goal is to make the layout responsive. So the first thing I like to do is open my DevTools and set it to stick to the right, and this way when I resize the page, I can see in the top right how wide my page currently is. And before we get started, let's talk about how to pick breakpoints. To me, it's a combination of popular device resolutions, but also just resizing the site and looking at where the layout starts breaking down manually. So right now we're at 1200 pixels wide, and to me there's a little bit too much padding and not enough room for the actual content. So let's fix that. And to start, we'll open our layout.scss file and we'll go to our main selector and we'll add a media query for max width and we'll set it to 80 rem. And what that does is tell the browser that up to a max width of 80 rem, we need to apply the following styles. And if you're not familiar with rem units, it's basically 80 times 16, so 1280 pixels, and the 16 comes from the font size of the HTML element. So here we'll change the padding and set it to spacing times 12, which is smaller than the usual spacing times 18 and 24. So next, we also want to trim some of the padding on the sidebar. So we'll open our sidebar.scss, and while in the previous file we put our media queries right inside of our selector, when there's a little bit more work to do, I like to put my responsive styles at the bottom of the file. So I'll grab the width and the padding of the sidebar content and go to the bottom, and I'll create a responsive section, and I'll do media max width 80 rem again, and I'll do a selector from my sidebar, and I'll just paste in what I have. And I'll change here the padding to 12 and the width to 24 so it accounts for the change in padding. So next I will grab the width that we have here and I will copy it over to my sidebar selector in my layout.scss file. So if we open the browser, you can see that there's already a lot more room for our article content, but I still want to remove some of the white space on the actual post itself. So we'll open post excerpt.scss. And we'll go to the bottom and we'll create a new section for responsive styles. And once again, we'll do max width 80 rem and we'll change the padding on the post excerpt. And we'll also go back up and grab the title and we'll change the margin bottom so it's a little bit tighter together. So this is starting to look pretty good to me. I do think there's a little bit too much space in between each post. So we'll go back to post index.scss. And I'll copy this and create a new media query, and I'll change the spacing between the posts from spacing times 24 to spacing times 12. And indeed, this looks much better to me. However, if we start resizing the page again, you'll notice that at around 960 pixels, the content is once again a little bit too narrow. So that's going to be our next breakpoint. So we'll go back to layout.scss, and in the app selector, I'll add a media query, and this time it's going to be 60 rem, and I'll do flex direction column, which means the sidebar and the content will be on top of one another instead of next to each other. But in the browser, they're actually on top of one another, and that's because we have fixed positioning on the sidebar. So we'll go back to the sidebar.scss and we'll grab our fixed top and fixed bottom selectors and we'll put them inside of a media query that's the opposite of max width 60 rem. But one thing to note is that media queries do include the number that you set. So if we just did min width 60 rem, we would have a 1 pixel overlap. So instead we need to use the syntax media not all and max width 60 rem, which is the opposite of max width 60 rem. And as you can see, we now have the sidebar on top of the content. So the next thing we'll do is we'll go to our sidebar.scss and we'll create a new section for max width 60 rem, and we'll set the sidebar and the sidebar content to have a width of auto so that the sidebar is not bunched up on the left anymore but takes up the whole width instead. Now the other problem is that the sidebar content doesn't line up with the post content. So we'll go back to our sidebar.scss file and we'll add some padding left and right. So this is much better, but I think there's too much space in between each element of the sidebar that's now a header. So we'll go back to the SCSS file and we'll change the margin top on the nav element and also on the social nav element. And as you can see, it's now a little more compact. So this is good for 960 pixels, but if we resize the page down to 480 pixels, which is a popular size for mobile phones, we can see that there's again too much padding. So we'll open our sidebar.scss and we'll create a new section for max width 30 rem, and we'll change the padding on our sidebar to spacing times 12. So next we'll open our layout.scss, and under our main selector we'll do max width 30 rem, and we'll remove the padding, which was that gray space around the post. But if we scroll down, you can see that we still have some in between the posts. So we'll go back to the layout.scss and we'll add a background of white. And next we'll open our post excerpt.scss and we'll add a new media query for max width 30 rem, and we will remove the box shadow. And the next thing is we'll open our post index.scss, and once again for max width 30 rem, and we'll create a selector for when we have two post excerpts next to one another, and we'll simply remove the margin top. And if we take a look in the browser, you can see that we've gotten rid of that gray background completely, and we've made a lot more space for our content. And if we resize the page, we can see that the website is now responsive and looks good at every resolution. So this will conclude today's video. If you've enjoyed it, please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. Thank you for watching.